So there's this idea that staying together for financial reasons, for the running of a household, in order to take care of children, like staying together for the children, right? Or because you've made a promise and it's an important legal and political contract that provides stability in society. Like all of those are sort of unworthy reasons to stay together. You should stay together because you feel love for each other, because you delight in each other's presence. Anything else is sort of sordid, grubby, much too pragmatic.
Welcome back to Communion and Shalom. We're back with part 2 of our conversation with Kathryn Mogk Wagner, our friendly scholar of medieval literature. She did her PhD dissertation at Harvard examining Middle English religious writings that interpreted the Latin liturgy of the day. But as you will see, that's not all she's knowledgeable about. She now serves at the Center for Christianity and Scholarship at Duke University. We especially wanted to hear Kathryn's perspective on how people's cultural approach to marriage, romance, eros, and sexual desire has changed over the centuries. So, let's jump right in. We've talked about how there's so much that's dumped into the kind of romance bucket, and that we expect so much in our modern culture, particularly in the West, to be coming out of your marriage relationship, your romantic relationship. And we're like, well, that's not how it always used to be. But we do see some ways that, like, as we're looking to the scriptures, we're looking at God's design, we're like, oh, but there are some, like, really deep, profound ways of what God is expressing in the marriage relationship. So we don't want to, like, diminish it too much. But Kathryn, I don't know, do you have thoughts, or can you help us? Like, how did we get to this, where romance, how it operates in our culture now? Because, I mean, there's like I don't know if it's Plato, like way old Greek, of like women are for children and men are for pleasure, where their culture was pretty bisexually practicing, that they were fairly utilitarian and how they kind of thought about sexual love with women. And anyways, this is a very different context than our context today.
Yeah, so I think this is the point where I'm going to kind of plunge into historical narrative of the development of the idea of romantic love. So I have this semi-prepared, so I'll speak extemporaneously from some notes, but feel free to jump in and challenge or clarify whatever you want.
Okay.
And
Sure.
I think that this will be, like, I really can't speak directly to the problem of people who are trying to incorporate romantic love for a person of the same sex into a celibate relationship. But I will say that I think that situation is essentially the same as the experience of a person who falls in love with a married person, right? Or who falls in love with a single person while they are married. It's structurally completely the same, in that you have this desire, you have this transformative experience, which feels very spiritually significant, even transcendent, that cannot be acted on through sexual activity. How do you deal with that? How do you cope with that? And so while the Christian tradition has very little in the way of resources for the same-sex case of that specifically, it has a lot of history dealing with this problem in the case of adultery. And we can hopefully maybe learn some lessons from that. So I'm gonna start just by saying there are certain phenomena, and I'll hit this note again of biology. There's certain phenomena that are sort of built into who we are as human beings, related to sexuality and sexual desire and attraction. And yet, something that is underlyingly sort of the same experience at some level has been culturally constructed differently and interpreted differently in different historical periods. So let me give you the concrete example. So sexual desire is much, much, much older than human beings. It's older than mammals, right? It has this very clear evolutionary purpose. And yet we can interpret it and act on it very differently, depending on our cultural context. Similarly, along with sort of like the raw libido, sexual desire, we have this phenomenon of bonding through oxytocin, right? A hormone which is called the love hormone, or the cuddle hormone, right? And it plays a really important role in childbirth, right? As you're giving birth, you get like a massive rush of oxytocin. It plays an important role in lactation, right? And in the release of milk. It is built up by various kinds of interactions, right? So cuddling, being physically close to each other tends to release oxytocin. Singing in a group actually is one of the things that releases oxytocin. And of course, having sex, you get a massive rush of oxytocin. And what it tends to do, it tends to bind people together with affection, right? So the feeling that a woman has on seeing her child just born, that as scripture says, she forgets all of her pains. And there's a unique and intense bond with this other person and a protective love and affection, right? It has this biological basis. And it's the same hormone that operates when two people interact in sexual activity, whether or not it's intercourse, right? And it has this clear evolutionary purpose, right? It's good for parents to have affection for their children. It's good if a father who has the option to leave, right, has an affection, a tenderness, a desire to care for a sexual partner so that he will stay with her and support their children. Another thing that is a little bit more questionably biological, but I think that it does have this continuity, is something that psychologists today call limerence. And it's a distinct psychological experience. Is really quite striking. And it's what we mean when we say someone falls in love. A slightly more clinical term is limerence. And it's a period of being obsessed with another person, constantly thinking about them, fantasizing about being together with them, getting into these kind of unhealthy, unbalanced seeming like cycles of thought, of the fixation on this person. And it typically lasts between 1 and 3 years. It will typically, and we can see here a kind of hint of the biological purpose of this experience, that like around 2 years is probably around the time that it would take to mate, to have 9 months of gestation, and to go through about a year when the child is getting all or most of their nutrition from breastfeeding. So that's a most vulnerable period of time. Right. So it's a good thing for parents to be locked into each other and obsessed with each other and unlikely to leave each other in that crucial window. So limerence experience is sort of what we mean when we're talking about romantic love, falling in love, or it's the biological basis. But it's been understood very, very differently in different historical periods.
Of course.
So from biology to history. And here I'm drawing really heavily on C.S. Lewis's The Allegory of Love, which is his first publication, his first major publication as a professor, his most famous and influential academic writing, which continues to be influential in medieval studies and literary studies. And it definitely has been questioned, right? Scholars are always quibbling. So there's some people who would dispute the way that Lewis tells the narrative, but I'm going to stick pretty close to how Lewis kind of tells the story. So in the ancient world, marriage is an economic arrangement, right? It is for the formation of households, for the purposes of reproduction, carrying on the family line, and purpose of production, right? And through the specialization and differentiation of labor, the production of food and clothes and the things that are necessary for this life. Marriages are primarily arranged, often by the parents or families of the couple, often while they're quite young. And there's really no romance to it at all. It's a very pragmatic arrangement. People do have what psychologists today would call experiences of limerence. But these are typically seen as irrational, disruptive, and degrading even, right? So the ancients imagine Eros or Cupid as a mischievous little boy who's playing tricks on people. He's the blind archer. He hits people with his bow who are totally inappropriate. So you can imagine sort of the position of a person falling in love in ancient literature as a man whose reason and will is overcome by having this bizarre obsession with a totally inappropriate person who is unworthy of their devotion, right? But they've been blinded. They've been hoodwinked by the mischievous spirit that is unsettling their whole life. So that's the situation in which Christians find themselves. And Christians will take a different and in some ways a radically countercultural view of marriage. In the culture around them, sex is for reproduction for women, right? Women must be vigilantly policed in their sexual behavior to ensure that they only bear the children of their spouse, and he doesn't have to raise a cuckoo, spend his resources on someone else's offspring. Men have sex with their wives in order to produce children and carry on the family line. They have sex with anybody else for pleasure, right? And this is primarily slaves. Slaves are kind of they allow sort of the excess sexual energy of high status men to be spent without those men being competitors for other high status men's wives, right? So the women can be kept pure for reproductive purposes. The slaves will take the burden of sexual desire. Christians will come into the situation and say, no, like adultery is not just a property crime of stealing someone else's wife who is his property. Adultery is something that men can be equally guilty of if they are having sex with an unmarried woman and they are being unfaithful to their own wife, right? This is a totally new idea. This is revolutionary for the ancient world to say that prohibitions against adultery are equally binding for both men and women. And Christians will say marriage is not only for procreation, for reproduction, it's also to contain sexual desire, right? That you can have one wife and stay with her and channel and direct and orient that raging libido into a way that is productive, that is generative, that involves kindness and care, that is a covenant. So Christians are definitely saying that sexual desire has to be disciplined, but they aren't saying that marriage should be romanticized. This is a very foreign idea, right? I don't think that there's anything really with Christians even engaging with the idea of the falling in love experience in those early days. And they do think of sex as something that is degrading, right? And that sexual desire makes someone irrational, causes a temporary absence of self-control. And for Augustine and for many of the other church fathers, sexual desire is always suspect. It's so deeply corrupted by the fall that it can't be done in a wholly innocent way, even within marriage, because it involves this lapse of reason. So C.S. Lewis says there's this turning point in the 11th century where something new comes into the world. As you begin to have troubadours and trouvères, these love poets in modern day France, who are talking about eros, about falling in love in a new way. It's probably there's some underlying continuity, right? The same sort of biological thing is happening in limerence. But instead of seeing it as something that is degrading, that's out of control, that makes a person a worse person, right? Less rational, less virtuous. They see this experience of falling in love as being ennobling. Falling in love makes you a better person. It makes you strive to achieve, to do great deeds, to win fame, even to become more moral, right? To become more virtuous in order to become worthy of the beloved person. So it's this radically new idea of romantic love as a positive good, as something that is deeply spiritually significant and that has a morally ennobling purpose. And this idea has transformed like all of subsequent history. But it takes a long time to kind of work it out. So in courtly love, which is a phenomenon among high status men and women, lords and ladies, knights in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, and especially in their literature. And so this is one of the debates about courtly love. How much is this a literary phenomenon that's about a lot of kind of genre conventions, and how much of it is something that is actually lived out? And there, I can't tell you for sure. I can tell you like what shows up in the literature. C.S. Lewis says that courtly love has 4 defining characteristics. So one is humility. The lover is generally lower in social status than the beloved. He also he sees her as this paragon of perfection, in beauty, in grace, in virtue, exceeding him. He sees himself as abjectly begging at her feet for mercy, totally unworthy of this beautiful woman and also of this beautiful thing that is happening to him. The second characteristic is courtesy. It's out of courtly love that we really get this idea that men should treat women with a special respect and deference, right? So there's a code of politeness, of a kind of conventionalized behavior, which is to be observed towards the beloved, but also towards all women, sort of for her sake. The third characteristic is a kind of religion of love. And it's a very, very interesting sort of literary approach where there's a sort of mock religion, really, whose god is Eros. God is this Cupid. And love has his own set of the commandments. He has his own holy orders of people who are especially dedicated to him. There's a conversion experience. There's like sanctification, this whole parallel. There's like the saints of love, of like past lovers. So this is mostly appearing in allegorical poetry. So we shouldn't take this as kind of an ontological claim about the reality of Cupid as a deity, but we should take it as an emotional claim that the experience of romantic love, the experience of falling in love, is so transformative, so transcendent, that the only like adequate metaphor that we can reach for is worship. Mm. And then the last characteristic of courtly love is that it is adulterous. In a society in which the marriages are arranged on economic grounds, like it has to be adulterous. Not only because you're usually, married to somebody else already for completely different reasons before you even like think about falling in love, before that experience comes to you, but also because marriage itself is hostile to this kind of romantic love. Right? You can't be, an abjectly humble lover pleading for the mercy of your lady and pledging obedience to her if you are above her in the social hierarchy and she is a member of your household who it's your role to govern, and her duty is to obey you. Right. So there's this fundamental problem, right? That imagine the courtly lover, like his life has been transformed by a spiritual experience for which seems to come and speak with like the very voice of God. It seems like a divine experience. It's something that is ennobling, that's leading him to be a better person, to be more courageous, to be more self-disciplined, to be more humble, and to do acts of service to others. And yet the thing that you want, the thing that your desire is leading you towards, is an offense against the commands of the true God, the highest God. It's a real problem.
What was this courtly love with this flair of adultery primarily celebrated in a sense from where the poets all male, and did this actually create a culture of where people didn't care if they were sleeping with each other's spouses? Or was it similar to the previous centuries where husbands were free to kind of commit adultery as long as it was kind of like someone of the lower class, or just someone who wasn't already married and you weren't infringing upon their household?
It definitely didn't create a culture in which it was okay to commit adultery, but it creates this sort of literary atmosphere in which it's very normal to be in love with somebody else's wife. And the people who have fallen in love with their lord's lady are in a tremendous ethical dilemma, right? So a lot of the poetry here sort of escaping into like this fantasy world where we're not thinking about the consequences. We're not thinking about what this actually looks like in reality. We're caught up in this passion, this longing, this yearning, this spiritually beautiful experience. And maybe it's consummated and maybe it isn't, but like the point is the longing. The point is the abject pleading. Like that is the emotional experience that we're most concerned with.
It makes me think of how Lewis does in Four Loves say that Eros would almost be content with just thinking about the object of its adoration. Like that you could just daydream about the lover and not actually have to ever even interact with him, because you're just so enamored, so obsessed with just this dreaming of it. And that especially in the context you say like, oh, someone falling in love with their lord's lady, like this is indeed like they are not worthy of this lady. They're the lower class, but they have fallen in love. And so thus it raises them up into like into this kind of moral virtue. I would want to be a person that my lord's lady would look upon me. If only she would look up, like, glance at me. And so they like daydream, they make poetry and stories, knowing that if they were to actually do something, they'd probably be killed. But then they'd write stories about, like, but it would probably be worth it.
Exactly. But there are cases where the practical consequences of this kind of thing are played out. And the best example, the paradigmatic example that you already know, is the love triangle of King Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot. And this is just like a perfect literary instantiation of this whole phenomenon, right? That, like, Lancelot is the greatest knight on earth. He has this incredible prowess. He's undefeated in battle. He also is morally excellent, right? He's a lion in the field and a lamb in the hall. He has this exceptional courtesy, gentleness, and deference to ladies, willingness to serve, willingness to show mercy to the defeated. He's a moral exemplar, as well as someone who does great deeds. He is these things in large part because he loves Guinevere, right? Like, he's drawn to win her approval. It's for that reason that he is so excellent a knight, is because of the love of his lady, because he's trying to make himself worthy of her. And yet he commits treason against his lord, Arthur, who he also loves and to whom he owes his obedience. And it's because of this fatal flaw, right, that the court of King Arthur is destroyed. The destruction, the fall, the death of Arthur is directly caused by sexual sin. Wow. Right? It is Lancelot's and Guinevere's adultery and their treason against Arthur that provides an opening for his enemies to divide the court, to cause Lancelot and his group and Gawain and his group to be at war with each other. And so then the army of Mordred can take over while Arthur and Gawain are fighting against Lancelot, their friend, their brother, in the fields of France, right? And so there's this very clear understanding, this holding together of two impossible truths. Like, one, that romantic love is ennobling, and the other that it is tremendously destructive. And it is the cause of the destruction of civilization, the destruction of, like, the best hope for the kingdom of God on earth can be destroyed by adultery.
Does Guinevere fall in love with Lancelot as well, but then repents and stays faithful with Arthur? I'm not actually super familiar.
She falls in love with Lancelot. She gives him her favor. They have sexual intercourse. And they carry on this affair for many years. They are caught in the act by Arthur's enemies, who have set up the scenario to catch them in order to cause this division in the court, to cause Arthur to have to kill his own wife.
Oh.
And so she's put on trial. She's about to be burned at the stake, and Lancelot swoops in and saves her. In the process, he kills several of his friends and creates this blood feud that can't be resolved. So the story, I mean, there's a lot of Arthur stories and they vary in the details. Guinevere, I think, certainly in Mallory, she goes to a nunnery. She renounces Lancelot and Arthur and goes to live a life of repentance and chastity. But it's too late. the harm is already done.
Kathryn, I'm wondering, so this is going back a little bit, but in this particular context that you're talking about, that I guess we'd call them European contexts now. So what are the marital customs? Are people being predominantly arranged? Arranged marriages are the common thing, I assume. But to what extent, as you start talking about kind of courtly love, etc., do you know to what extent the woman's choice or the love between the two is starting to play a role in marriage, if at all? Or is it still predominantly arranged at this point in these European contexts we're talking about, without their consideration of their feelings as much, is what I mean?
Yeah. So it does differ somewhat by social classes. So
Sure.
the higher you are up in the social status, the more things are going to be arranged for you for economic and for political reasons.
Yeah.
Among peasants, We know from church records of the dates of weddings and baptisms that like a significant portion of babies were born a little bit too early. And, it goes up and down over time, but it's not a negligible amount. And so that seems to indicate that a significant proportion of marriage among the lower classes is actually following on sexual desire. So I don't know if they're thinking about that in terms of romantic love. I don't know if there is a limerence experience, but there definitely seems to be more of a choice in that people are coming together before they're married. And so they have more freedom in that sense. But those people just don't leave as many records. We don't know what their experience was like from inside because they aren't able to describe it for us. Among the upper classes, things are very, very much arranged. There's a shift that the church wants to value consent, and consent not only of the parents, but of both of the parties in the marriage. And this is part of reforms in the 11th century, that the church is trying to regulate marriage more strictly. So there's a couple of kind of related movements, like they want to enforce chastity and celibacy for priests and say priests cannot be married. They want to make marriage into a sacrament that needs to be presided over by a priest, right? Rather than happening in a private home or in a field, or in a barn somewhere. People make a promise to each other and exchange a ring. And then it's he said, she said, like, did that promise actually happen? Mm-hmm. Right? They say, no, it has to be public. It needs to be at the church door with witnesses, with the priest as a witness. And then there's also this move to say that consent is really important. And we have to have the consent of the spouses and not just the consent of their families for the marriage to be valid. That if there's not consent, it's not a true marriage and it can be annulled. So that happens kind of over time. This becomes more important and the church becomes stricter about regulating consent. But you can certainly have a situation where it was the parents' idea and they arranged it and they put pressure on the people. And then each of them did consent and agree to what was happening, but it wasn't initiated by them.
I just want to make a comment. I don't want to pursue this much in this particular podcast, but there's really interesting permutations for how this developed later in Africa or in other contexts through missionary movements, as well as it'd be interesting to think more about the Eastern Church, which canon law flowed differently in different ways about marriage in the Eastern Church than kind of this predominant conversation that we're having about maybe what we might call the Western Church and the European-centric Western Church. Just want to throw that out there. It'd be interesting to, hopefully we can engage in that more in future podcasts.
Yeah, I would love that conversation. I'm sorry, this is a very Western-centric.
No.
This is what I happen to know.
And it's also applicable because most of our American culture is formed by this Western history.
100%. It's totally applicable. Kathryn, your knowledge is invaluable to this conversation. We're so happy you're here. But I think it helps you imagine different, like, how could it have been different? Yeah. How did it happen differently in places to help, I think, just break open our imagination a little bit. Yeah. And in the same way as you brought up social construction, even the Christian faith is being developed in different expressions and constructions in different places or contexts, right? Like they're responding to different circumstances, different milieus, different physical environments, whatever.
It's interesting. As you were kind of sharing about this development that then into the courtly age, the religion of love, I was like, is this somehow a result of Christianity's kind of movement towards monogamy? That it was really the early church that was like, polygamy, but really we should be monogamous. And in addition to harsher restrictions towards adultery. And it was like, did this monogamous environment lead to this moving from just a rejection and suspicion of sex to a almost like glorification in limerence and falling in love? But then you brought in the whole thing of adultery and it's like, it's actually not a love of monogamy. It's almost like out of the bounds of especially arranged monogamy that these people higher in the courts became obsessed with being able to follow their desires. Yet it had this ennobling reality because it was often drawing them to someone that they was out of touch, which has this kind of like drawing you to the divine, drawing you out of it, let alone the experience itself feeling supernatural at times.
So we have these people who are caught in this problem where the truth that they know about God and the truth that they seem to be experiencing about romantic love are totally incompatible with you. And so you have several centuries of people struggling to find a synthesis. How can courtly love, how can the experience of falling in love be integrated into a Christian view of the world? And I'm going to tell you about two examples, two different paths that people try to take. So the one is exemplified by Dante. He tells us in the Vita Nuova that when he was 9 years old, he was walking in the streets of Florence and he saw a little girl in a red dress. And let me just read to you a little bit of what he says. At that moment, I say most truly that the spirit of life, which has its dwelling in the secret chamber of the heart, began to tremble so violently that the least pulses of my body shook therewith. And in trembling it said these words, "Behold a God stronger than me, who in his coming will be Lord over me." And the animate spirit, which dwells in the lofty chamber whither the senses carry their perceptions, was filled with wonder, and speaking to the spirits of the eyes, said these words, "Now your beatitude has been made manifest." At that moment, the natural spirit, which dwells where our nourishment is administered, began to weep, and in weeping said these words, "Woe to me miserable, because from now on I will often be hindered." This experience, seeing this girl and feeling that a Lord stronger than him had come to have dominion over him, defines the rest of Dante's entire life. All of his poetry, virtually all his poetry, is inspired by his love of Beatrice and his attempts to understand what it is that has happened to him in seeing this revelation of glory within a human body. He writes the Vita Nuova, he writes his early poetry in praise of Beatrice. Meanwhile, he is also getting married and has 4 children with Gemma Donati. So there's this separation of his spiritual love for the woman who is for him like the glory of heaven revealed on earth, and his pragmatic, domestic, economic love, in his household with his wife. Beatrice dies young and he grieves her, and he writes the Divine Comedy, again, as in part, the Divine Comedy is many things, but the Divine Comedy is a kind of wrestling with and a working through what Beatrice is, what Beatrice means to him. It's Beatrice who sends help for him when he is lost in a dark wood, when he's lost his way. So she is, in a sense, an efficient cause of his salvation. And it's Beatrice who is his guide through the heavens, right? That as he goes with Virgil tells him over and over again, "I don't know. I can't tell you that. This is a mystery that's beyond me. Wait for Beatrice. Beatrice will give you the answers." And so Beatrice is a kind of allegorical representation of divine revelation, of theology, even suggested that she is a kind of Eucharistic figure, right? The revelation of God in a body. And Beatrice takes him all the way up into the heavens and into the very presence of God and the beatific vision. So Dante seems to be saying here, he gives to romantic love, I think, the highest praise that anybody has ever given, right? To say that this thing that we might call liverance, the falling in love experience, is a genuine means of access to God himself, that it has salvific power, that it is a true revelation. And that Dante doesn't, in Plato's Symposium, there's a ladder, right? You leave behind the lower stages of merely bodily beauty as you ascend higher and higher into realms of abstraction. But for Dante, Beatrice comes with him all the way. At the very end, she looks away from him to the eternal fount, and they're united in both looking at God instead of Dante looking at Beatrice and Beatrice looking to God. But he thinks that romantic love, I think, never has to be left behind and transcended. It remains a revelation of divinity to the very end. Mm-hmm. So this is not a consummated love, right? This is something that has been transmuted from the sexual into, let's say the transforming and defining experience of his life, which is absolutely a desire for beauty, a desire to be united with the beautiful, right? But has no hope whatsoever of consummation in physical union.
Does Beatrice die before they even get romantically involved, or are they married and then she dies, or do we have that information?
No. they never have a relationship. Dante pines after her and writes poetry about her. Like, anonymous. I mean, like, he doesn't want it to be known that he's in love with her, right? And this is part of the kind of humility topos. I'm so unworthy that, like, I can't even reveal that she's the one that I love, right? So he's writing poetry to a lady who's unnamed in his poems.
I just think about, like, the lived experience of especially young adults in that, like, falling in love with someone, and then you actually, like, start to get to know them, and they fall short of, like, your dreamed person. Like, we have this imaginary beauty, wonderful, everything I would want that person to be. And some of that's just out of, like, selfishly just wanting what we want. And then it's good that you actually meet a person, you learn to, like, sacrifice and truly love. But there's something in that initial just enamorment of that. It is really interesting to see that, like, oh, in a story where it didn't, like, oh, you actually got to know them and you realize that they're mortal too. It's not the divine embodiment of beauty that you thought that that person was. In this story with Dante, she died before he ever had that mortalizing or, like, encountering reality to dim his, like, that initial experience. And it was able to then be this kind of, it got fixed in this holy state, or, like, transcendent, like, beyond what he would ever experience on earth, and thus did lead him to this kind of pursuing the heavenly vision. And so it maps on really well with this saying, oh yeah, what is love pointing to? What is human love and beauty and romance, like, drawing us into in God's eternal love? And often we just get tripped up in our earthly disappointments because we do, rather than letting that draw us upward, we keep trying to find that sideways, which I think is why maybe even in these, like, earlier courtly expressions or in modern, it saddens me a lot when you hear, like, 30-year marriages breaking apart and the spouse is like, well, my spouse fell in love with someone else, whether it was another guy, whether it was another girl. And they're just like, what else could we do but let them now follow where they followed in love? But, like, that second romance or marriage will hit its own disappointment of its own limits of on the earthly side, that it won't, what you're longing for won't be found here ultimately. So I'm really, yeah, I think that this is a really beautiful or intriguing example of what happens if you don't try to find it on the earthly level. And the disappointment, he got disappointed by that she died, but it wasn't the disappointment that she was less than what he was hoping her to be.
Yeah, and I meant to say this earlier when I was talking about limerence. The psychological research says that it tends to go away in two different ways. Like, either if it's resolved because you're successful in pursuit of the limerent object, and, like, they become just another human being who sometimes leaves toast crumbs in the bed or puts the toilet roll on the wrong way or whatever. Right. Or if you accept, like, it's never going to happen, if you get, like, a definite rejection and you give up and there's no hope that you're going to be with the person, then it will also resolve. Right. And part of the kind of structure of courtly love is to keep alive this hope for something that is almost impossible, but not quite right. So that you can stretch out, instead of having a year or two of limerence, you can have decades of limerence, which is psychologically unhealthy, I would say. But I mean, for Dante, right, he's able to, let's say, transmute this love, sublimate this love, to take the true thing that he saw when he saw this girl in the streets of Florence and turn it into love of God, turn it into great poetry, to follow on from the experience of romantic love, those greater things of which it is an image or a shadow, without leaving that first initial image or shadow behind and rejecting it, taking it with him into the fulfillment, the full banquet of which it's the foretaste.
One of my professors who taught me theological ethics he often talked about a skepticism towards, I guess he said contemporary, but Christian movements which put a lot of sacred weight into sex in particular, right? I think our podcast was more in that vein, but I'm curious, Kathryn, even as we kind of continue this conversation, what's your general thought on that from your studies? To what extent would you evaluate putting a lot of kind of sacred weight, divine weight in sex particularly, or even romance? How do you kind of evaluate this first strategy in relation and sex?
I think that, it's dangerous to put too much weight on sex in particular or romance in particular. And that's one thing that I was uncomfortable with Cunningham is a kind of superlative that this is the greatest expression of love. This is the clearest image of love. I think that it's really important to have multiple different images or different metaphors and kind of triangulate, right? To not get too fixed on one particular image of God. You always have to be saying, this also is thou, neither is this thou. Like, this is like God. It does show me something about God, but it's also very, very much not like God. And it is misleading in certain ways. It needs to be corrected by other images.
I can definitely see that. I often notice, I'll just say a lot of married people that I'm around who are Christian pastors or elders or priests or whatever. That is their general modus operandi, to put that emphasis on marriage so much, because it's basically the love they've experienced, right? Like they emphasize it so much because they've experienced it. When they're in a system which really incentivizes that as the good, or puts all the weight on that as like what the epitome of Christian life in relationship should be.
Between Cunningham and what I generally hear in our milieu is people often like, oh, marriage, it's this place where you can find committed love. Yeah, and it's in the covenant love that we really know God and we see his faithfulness. And what Cunningham does so wonderfully is he says it's about sex, not about covenant. It is a covenant. Yeah. It absolutely is a covenant. It's grounded on a covenant, but its focus is not merely to like maintain fidelity and express that you're able to keep a promise, and it just happens to be the marriage promise. And because like what this does is also then helps remind people that, oh yeah, there's other covenant promises that we make, in whether as godparents, as in the church fellowship, in other specific relationships as friendships or brotherhoods or sisterhoods. And that like all of those are also covenantal, and they are all wonderful places where we can experience God's covenant faithfulness love. That does happen in marriage, but that should also be happening in like so many relationships. Yeah. And so I do. So usually when people are talking about like, oh, you need to be married, you can experience God's love, they're talking about covenant faithfulness because they've not experienced covenant faithfulness in other relationships, which I think is more of a societal issue that we have. I have never heard anyone before Cunningham be like, you need to get married because sex is a window into the divine. And even Cunningham says, but the true heroes of Eros are celibate people because they're kind of skipping the metaphor and jumping through the window. Sure. So
they're closer to seeing the real, because everyone else is engaged in sex.
It is engaged in the metaphor. And so if you like with Dante, Cunningham would say if Beatrice did stay alive, that the way that he could have kind of earthly consummated that love and that desire and that enamorment would have been to consummate a marriage with her and have sex with her. And as he says, pursue mutual orgasm, where they can mutually be enjoying one another and experiencing that in true like harmony. So if you want to hear a pastor talk directly about that, go to Cunningham's conference. And what Cunningham says is that like that is kind of, in a sense, the high natural point of marriage that is very precious and sacred designed and not easily attained. Most people don't attain it, but it's still just a window. And Dante, because Beatrice died, he gets to focus on kind of jumping through the window or continuing to gaze through the window rather than perfecting the earthly.
But Dante was also married to his wife.
Oh,
yeah. Kathryn mentioned that he had a
Sorry,
wife.
I missed that.
So, yeah.
So there's all kinds of reasons. He couldn't consummate that relationship because she died. He also couldn't consummate that relationship because in his society, marriage is an economic union. Right? There were very different reasons to get married, and people expected to have very different feelings about their husbands and their wives than they had about the people they fell in love with. Right. And so this is something that, like, the problem remains. So I was going to say, I said that there were sort of two solutions, two different directions. And so the other one comes later, and it's slow to develop. But I think, like, probably the greatest, like, literary embodiment of this is actually in Edmund Spenser, the development of what sociologists have called companionate marriage. And this is resolving the tension by making falling in love a reason or the reason to get married. And so this, in Spenser's allegory, we have lovers who are separated from each other and trapped in the house of Bousserine, which is a kind of physical embodiment of courtly love with all of its genre conventions, all of its literary toboi, all of this kind of quasi-religious structure of devotion, and trying to escape the house of Bousserine and enter into a marriage that will include passionate romantic love, that will be publicly, socially acknowledged as a covenant, and that will be fruitful and bring forth children. Spenser is the great poet of married love. He writes a sonnet cycle, the Amoretti, in which he's drawing on earlier sonnet writers like Petrarch, who had written many, many poems to Laura, who is this unattainable woman that he is unworthy of. And he has no hope for an actual relationship. He's just, like, suffering in his devotion for her. Spenser takes up the same form and many of the same, like, literary motifs, and he writes it to his wife, right? He writes a happy ending in which romantic love can issue in marriage, right? And so it's this is, and it takes a long time for this to go from an idea to the norm, which we take for granted, right? That marriage should involve romantic love, that romantic love is a good reason, or maybe the only good reason to get married is because you've fallen in love. And that's so normal to us, right? That's like the background of our lives, but it's an achievement that has to be won, working through this paradox, this terrible, impossible situation that the early writers, the early people in courtly love found themselves in, to say, no, like, I should marry the one that I love. And it should be a holistic union of persons that includes this emotional drama of falling in love and includes the economic, pragmatic functions of marriage and the production of children. That all of that should not be separated out into different relationships. It should be united so that one person is the object of all of these different desires: romantic, sexual, economic, procreative. And you can see that, like, on the whole, I think that this is a good thing. I think that the people who found this solution did the right thing, right? They made it possible to have, like, a new kind of marriage that is, emotionally intimate, that satisfies relational needs and not just the sort of the economic functions of marriage. They gave us something that's incredibly rich, but they also, you can see that there's a tendency to say, like, all of the needs, all of the desires are met in one person, that we will see has negative consequences for people who, for whatever reason, can't get married or can't marry the person that they fall in love with.
Yeah. Who have tricky marriages for whatever reasons as well.
And this is a very Protestant thing, right? Spenser
sure.
is a Protestant, and this is very characteristic of sort of the Protestant spirit.
What century is Spenser?
The 16th century.
Kathryn, I wanted to ask you, so Spenser, what were his contemporaries saying, which may have been providing a contrasting view of what marriage could be in that context? Like, or if he was Protestant, what were the Catholics around him saying? Because I think insofar as you're describing his sort of contribution, as you said, became dominant. And that's now what we assume is the way. But what were the alternatives on offer in his time? by contemporary other Protestants or Catholics that would have been something different, if at all, if they existed?
Yeah, I wouldn't attribute this to Spenser. I think that he is the best articulator of kind of this new spirit, but he's very deeply influenced by the Protestant revolution in thinking about marriage, right?
Sure.
Which we can look to Martin Luther, a monk who had taken vows of celibacy, who gets married to Katie, his wife, who had been a nun. And so there's this move from a Catholic sensibility, which emphasizes very strongly that marriage is good, but virginity is better, right?
Yeah.
Inspired by Paul, 1 Corinthians 7, which is what Paul says, that the life of a virgin, the life of the single person, can be more wholly dedicated to God. And it's truly the celibate person, right, in the medieval imagination, and I think this is probably true, who is able, David, in your words, to jump through the window, right, to go straight to God, to dedicate, to orient all of their longing, right, all of their yearning towards God himself directly, not through these various images. And so that's the very high view of virginity and celibacy in the Catholic Church, which really creates a hierarchy, right? That those people who are dedicated virgins have a higher spiritual status. They have access to God that married people will just never have. For most of the tradition, it is really either or. Like, either you can have eros for God in bridal mysticism, in mystical union, right? In the devotion of contemplation and the ecstasies of being united to God, even on this earth, or you can have marriage in which your eros is directed towards another person and towards the generation of children within the household and the family. It's really, I mean, very strongly, it's one or the other. And the celibate's kind of eros is just better. So this has the unfortunate negative consequence of creating a hierarchy in the church of people who can be close to God in a special way and people who just can't. Protestants overturn that. They place a really high value on the married life and of the family as the sort of miniature church, as part of their general movement to say that, like, this life is good. The vocation of somebody making shoes, of somebody who's ruling in state governance, of somebody who is a farmer, like, those are good vocations that are obedient to God, that glorify God. It's not just the people who spend all day praying and reading the Bible, who are doing God's will and who have closeness to God. So it's that general movement. Marriage is like one specific instance of it, to say, like, no, priesthood of all believers, everybody has access. This life is good. The things of this life can be holy. So that's where Spenser is drawing on this sort of Protestant spirit. Does that speak to your question at all?
I think it does. Kind of as a follow-up question, a comment. When I talk to Protestants in contemporary times in the U.S. and outside, but celibacy it's not really on their radar as much of a good. They might say that occasional someone has a gift or something, but like it's just something
for something else. It's for someone else.
Yeah, it's for someone else.
Yeah. But, I mean, modern Protestants have really reversed that hierarchy and often see marriage as a sign of spiritual maturity or a prerequisite to church leadership. I think that hierarchy is dangerous both directions. The Bible does say that there's a special blessing for the life of celibacy. I think making it too rigid of a hierarchy in either direction can lead us to not honor the lives of our brothers and sisters.
How does Songs of Solomon play into the church's imagination throughout these centuries? Did they just kind of dismiss it?
Yeah, so the Song of Songs is hugely, hugely important for Christian life and thought throughout the Middle Ages. And especially, I think there's like a flowering in the 12th, 13th centuries of commentaries on the Song of Songs, of which St. Bernard of Clairvaux's series of sermons is probably the best known example, but there are many. The Song of Songs is interpreted by the Church Fathers and by medieval exegetes as an allegory in which the image of sexual love is used to depict the love between Christ and his church, or between Christ and the individual believer. And so it's very much part of this either or mentality. I mean, or let's say that Song of Songs interpretation takes place within a sort of pre-existing structure of either or. You can direct eros towards other bodies in marriage, or you can direct eros towards God alone. Being married sort of disqualifies you from engaging in this spiritual desire. Or, I mean, not even being married. Like, there's this phenomenon in the Middle Ages of people who are married but then take a vow of celibacy. So they continue living together in a household with each other, but they're not having sex anymore. Right. So like one example of this is Marjorie Kemp, who's a 14th century mystic who like badgers and nags her husband and finally strikes a deal with him that she's not going to fast so extremely. She'll eat some food and stop like torturing her body, like if he agrees that he'll never have sex with her again. And they also have like, she's like an entrepreneur. She like runs a small business. And so there's an economic element even there, but she was bargained that they're going to be in a chaste marriage, a celibate marriage. And then she starts going around dressed in white and saying that like Christ has made her a virgin spiritually. And now that enables her to have this kind of unique, special intimacy with God. So it's really one or the other is the assumption. And the people who are reading the Song of Songs are reading it as an expression of spiritual desire for God, for which sexuality is an image, but not as in itself saying anything important about our sexuality. And I would say that's the really dominant way of interpreting it. But it's hugely important for them.
And it, like an image to be seen through, but not to be experienced through, if I can make contrast. Like they can like, oh yeah, it's a sexual image in order to think about the spiritual, but like let's not actually try to work that out in our own sex lives.
Yeah, it's a metaphor or an allegory for something that is very difficult to put into words. But if you actually engage in the metaphor, then you're going to get stuck there, right? You won't be able to look through it to see that which is truly transcendent. I think that's the mentality there.
Okay.
So again, this ideal of companionate marriage, like it takes a while to work out, right? Because different social classes, different contexts, people have like different degrees of freedom to marry. So like we have this ideal articulated in the 16th century, but like in the early 19th century, as Jane Austen is writing, you still have a lot of tension. That's a lot of the drama of Austen's novels. And this is why so many present day romance novels are set in the Regency period, because you have this really interesting tension in which people want to marry for love. They're trying to marry for love. They also have to take these economic considerations into account. They have to get parental approval. They have to have the financial basis for starting a family. All right. And there's this pull and push as you're trying to integrate the sexual, the romantic, the economic into a single union. And so there's something fascinating about that problem, I think, that continues to be compelling for readers today. But it is, you can see that this integrated model in which marriage is serving all of these purposes together is dominant in the 18th, 19th centuries. The last development that I'll leave you with and sort of the world that we live in today is what sociologist Anthony Giddens calls the pure relationship, which is, I think, the dominant way of thinking about sexual and romantic love of our time. The pure relationship is when two people come together because they delight in each other, right? Because they desire each other and for no other reason. So as soon as both parties no longer feel romantic love for each other, then it's right for them to separate. And you can see that this is a sort of the final development of the romantic love that we've traced, which at first is in contradiction to a kind of economic model of marriage, then is united that romantic and economic purposes should be served in the same relationship. Now we have kind of a breaking free of the romantic element as dominant and the economic element as subordinate or even non-existent. So there's this idea that staying together, for financial reasons, right, for the running of a household, in order to take care of children, like staying together for the children, right, or because you've made a promise and it's an important legal and political contract that provides stability in society. Like all of those are sort of unworthy reasons to stay together. You should stay together because you feel love for each other, because you delight in each other's presence. Anything else is sort of sordid, grubby, much too pragmatic. The pure relationship, it springs into like full expression as sex is separated from reproduction with the widespread use of contraception.
Sure.
But you can see that it has its roots all the way back in like the 11th century, right? As people start developing the idea of a spiritually significant, transcendent, emotional experience, which is radically separate from the pragmatic considerations of running a household. That earlier emotional revolution kind of makes the sexual revolution possible once you combine it with the availability of contraception.
Mm-hmm.
And, Giddens was sort of prophetic. In the 90s, he was predicting like the pure relationship will lead to polyamory. It will lead to the acceptance of same-sex marriage. It will lead to all kinds of new and exciting sexual expressions, sexual behaviors as an expression of one's individuality, right? As a sort of creative self-expression. Once you have broken that link with the reproductive and economic roles of sex and made it purely about a emotionally fulfilling relationship, that is the key to the changing sexual behaviors that we see around us in modern Western societies. So like maybe the purest expression of the pure relationship. I recently, one of my really good friends, two of my really good friends broke up with each other. These are not Christians. I'm close to both of them, and I talked with both of them about the breakup, and the guy, they had lived together for 3 years, right? Their finances, their household were really entangled. They had made plans about the future, kind of counting on each other. But, they were no longer content with each other, especially the guy was unsatisfied with the relationship. And I was talking to him and sort of saying like what promises did you make? Like what expectations did you have? Like, don't you consider yourself bound by the things that you've said in the past explicitly, or like by the things that combining your households kind of implies about your intentions for the future? And he said, my parents told me that love means choosing each other every day, right? It's not real love if you are just staying together out of duty or obligation or because of promises you made in the past. Like true love is constantly choosing each other. And that's the end point of the pure relationship is purely sexual and emotional desire without the element of a covenant or even the element of a contract that disciplines eros to make it fruitful, make it productive, make it a safe place for vulnerable women and children. That's the world we live in today.
I'm really thankful for Kathryn's storytelling here, and kind of left in shock. It's a little jarring, but also refreshing to get a bird's eye view of your own culture by seeing how the sexual, romantic, economic, and reproductive relational elements have culturally developed. It's interesting to see the transition from marriage as an economic and reproductive alliance to courtly extramarital romance to the recent companionate marriage, and now to the pursuit of the quote-unquote pure relationship, divorced from economic and reproductive roles and focused on sexual romantic fulfillment. So in part 3, we take some time to reflect and process all of this. The worlds that TJ and I live in are mostly dominated by this pure relationship model, and we want to think about how we as Christians should live and respond. Hey listeners, I want to let you know about the Communion and Shalom Patreon. Joining the Patreon community not only supports this podcast, but gives you the opportunity to listen to bonus content, give input on future episodes, and submit questions for a patron-only Q&A. We're so thankful for the support and encouragement from so many listeners, and we hope that this podcast continues to be meaningful to you.